Like I've mentioned during the planning, that I attended the workshop of Matthias Nowak on Thursday, and that was about software architecture, more concrete about hexagonal architecture, so how to decouple your business logic from your framework and other components. And there were some interesting things in there where I've started to recognize, oh, that's why TYPO3 is doing that. And thinking for that for 2 days, I've now the feeling that, okay, most often during updates and kind of things, people might be frustrated because, oh, why, it worked for 10 years or so? Why do I need to change it right now? Like, for example, TYPO3 version 13 will update to Doctrine Debal 4, and that has many, many breaking changes. One of them is that in order to quote things, you can only put in strings, and maybe you are still using integers or stuff like that for numbers, and so that will create effort during updates. And one might think, well, why? It worked for 10 years. So why do we have to, why all this effort and workload and stuff like that? And for me, as mentioned, I've attended the workshop, and that was about the separation of different parts of the architecture, like, as mentioned, our business or our custom code, I'd say, and the actual integration, like, do we talk to Doctrine Debal, do we talk to an Elasticsearch, MongoDB, all those kind of things. And this is a book of Matthias Nowak, who gave the workshop. And there he goes way more into that, when to use an ORM, how to use an ORM, how to separate things and stuff like that. And one of those things is, in order to separate the actual class, like in repository, like used in TYPO3, and this concept is also used in other frameworks and projects, that's responsible for knowing, okay, I'm infrastructure code, and I know that we use Doctrine Debal, that we use in relational database and stuff like that. But everything else shouldn't know about that. That's just communicating to the repository, and it just doesn't care whether it's MongoDB, Debal, whatever, a flat file system. And that layer, the repository, should also not be concerned about what the other code is doing. So it just should say, okay, in order to find a book, for example, within the repository, I just need the ID, the identifier, whatever that is. And that's the only thing I need in order to return that to you. So why should you provide something that's way more concrete, like an object holding this information, or more information like, okay, it's of type integer or something like that, because that doesn't matter. It's just, okay, give me whatever the identifier is, and I will send it back to you. And already by adding the information as an integer, we are limiting ourselves. So it might work for a relational database like MySQL with auto-increment values and stuff like that, like TYPO3 does with UIDs. But if you're using something else like Solr or Elasticsearch, it might be something else. It might be in string. It might be a combined identifier, and then certainly it won't work anymore. So you would limit yourself because of this technology, and it's manifesting within your application. So that's why you, at least my understanding after attending the workshop and reading parts of the book, is, okay, that's because of those separation of infrastructure and my actual application. And now it's not being frustrated that Doctrine Debal is doing stuff which adds workload on me, but saying, now I understand, and yeah, they are doing the right thing, and they allowed me to do it the wrong all the years back, and didn't force me to think about it and adapt to that. And now things are changing. That's at least my feeling within PHP community as a whole. There's so much focus on static code analysis, code quality, and stuff like that. So people are really into doing it the right way. I had the feeling for a very long time it was like, yeah, just let's take the word over. PHP is so easy to get into it and just build whatever you like and don't care about anything. Of course, there are always people who care more or less, but nowadays I have the feeling that a bigger group within the community is really focusing on high quality. And also with new design concepts or already existing, sometimes dating back to the 80s, also even before I was born. And we are now trying to apply all those learnings to our PHP code base. And so Doctrine Debug and other kind of things existed just like TYPO3 for a very long time already, when those things maybe sometimes couldn't even be applied because there was a bad object-oriented support in PHP and stuff like that. And now they are, just like TYPO3, are cleaning things up, which are dating back to the very, very old day. And so instead of being frustrated and saying, okay, yeah, thanks for that, now I have to do work, it's way better to try to get into all those kind of things so we have a better understanding and that it turns around from frustrating to happiness, because now we are really looking forward to update to that version, because then it's just the way it should have been already. At least for me, that switches the feeling, and we already had talks about burnout and stuff like that, so I guess that also is a thing for us to be more happy at our work. So I've just picked 2 concrete examples here, because it wasn't intended to be a presentation to you, but more like, okay, maybe some from the core so can sit here and tell me, yeah, that now you got it, and yeah, we maybe should spread the word more so more people can understand and instead of complaining. But yeah, I don't see anyone here from the core, so yeah, I'll just continue. So another thing which is pretty much related to that is the new support for UUIDs within TYPO3. With the old mindset, starting this week, I was thinking, yeah, okay, if probably someone sees the need for it, there you go. But why should I care? We have the UIDs, everything is working since years, since I've started with TYPO3, so why should I care about this, whatever it does? And that's related insofar as I've already mentioned right now, probably the UID, at least if you're using Doctrine Debug, it will inspect how is it stored within the database. Oh, it's an integer column, so I will cast it for you. So I will send an integer back to you, and then we pass it through our code. We'll send it back there, and there, whoa, now you want a string, but you already gave me that as an integer. Now I have to convert it for you to use it again. And the thing is, an integer how it works right now is we don't care about the identity of an object within TYPO3 and most probably also in other environments. We just say to the database, please store that. And afterwards, please send me the ID, because we have an auto-increment value in the database, like the UID column within TYPO3. So, but that would mean, in the sense of the domain-driven design, we also had that talk here yesterday, our domain model, like for example the book, is it actually existing from a philosophy point of view before I've stored it actually in the database? Because what it makes an entity actually is that there is this identifier, and there was no identifier until I've stored it. And I know that there were discussions within TYPO3 and XBase, which I could follow, but I didn't get the real trouble regarding all those validation, because when you have your controller in TYPO3, it will automatically convert it. It will see an UID or whatever you have submitted while creating your book via form. We create, construct a model, like in domain-driven design for you, send it to your controller action, and there you have a valid thing, because it already was validated, but still didn't have an ID. But to us, it communicates as it's a working entity, but I can't even pass it around because I don't have an identifier. How can I order this thing? So I first need to save that. So we have an invalid valid entity at that moment. And yeah, the real issue even was that it was created per validation, and then you validate afterward the entity. So that was, at least in that discussion, the underlying issue. And so the thing is that instead, we first need to create this entity. So let's say we are a library and our application is for this library and they got new books in and now they need to enter them to the system in order to offer them to their customers. They will insert all those information like author, title, things like that. And then a process is starting. So it's always about humans, we have that here as well, and processes, and what do they want to achieve? They want to add a new book to the inventory of the library. So there's a process behind that. So it shouldn't even belong to the controller. The controller, in the sense of those architecture design, is just the integration of our processes to the web application. Because there could also be a REST API or a desktop application or a mobile phone or command line or whatever, these new glasses stuff coming up and stuff like that. So we don't know how to access this process maybe in the future. So that's why we should encapsulate that. And so we retrieve this information, validate that data, because that's part of the web UI, because we need to represent the validation issues back. But that's just the integration of the web application. And once we've done all that and say, okay, yeah, that's fine, then we pass it over to our domain and say, okay, that was the submitted data, which I find valid. Now go ahead and add this as a book to the inventory. And then that, our domain, again, needs to validate whether it complies to our domain, but that's a different kind of validation. One validation is just user input and sending that back to a human, so it's a human interaction, because that's different whether you're on a mobile phone and REST API, you always need to communicate that in a different way. And then we are now in our domain with just plain data, also all strings, because on the command line, those are strings when we receive them. In our web requests, get and post are always strings. Every time when we are not dealing with strings, that's where magic already happens through our framework and stuff like that, through Symfony commands, through parsers, where we annotate things like also view helpers, where we can say, okay, this is of type X, and then it will do something for us. But the input always is a string. So again, we only have strings at that time. And then we will receive those infos, and now we are in our domain, and now we can create this entity, a new book, based on this data which we receive from somewhere. We don't know, that's a separation of framework and our domain. It could be a controller, it could be a command, it could be a webhook, it could be anything. So we receive that. Now we create that entity, and in order to have a valid entity, the identifier is part of that, because otherwise it would be a value object, and I'm not able to handle that in my, it's in fact an entity. It needs to have an identifier for my inventory and stuff like that. So I need to add this identifier somehow. And it won't work with this current approach, because therefore I first have to store an incomplete entity which someone else could already retrieve, which would be invalid from this perspective. And if I change to an Elasticsearch or something else, then it won't generate an ID for me, because not every database can generate the ID. Not everything has this auto-increment. So I would need to create the identifier upfront, and that's where libraries like for UUIDs come in, and he also mentions in his book that there's already a new thing, like there most often is. And UUID, as explained in the book, is just something system-specific, the system time, and some randomness. So that's pretty unique. So you can generate it upfront. And these UUIDs are typically like numbers, characters, and dashes. So it's, again, a string and not an integer. You can convert them back and forth, at least that's what's written in the book. I didn't have a deeper look yet. So again, we have strings. So string, more or less, is a very basic type that always seems to work. Yeah?
Going to make it a bit more complex. Now you have UUIDs. How do you know the difference between an identifier of your customer and a UUID identifying your book?
Yeah, good question. Do I have an answer? Yeah.
Well, in domain-driven design, they tell that every, let's call it scalar values, which are integers, booleans, strings, etc., should be wrapped in a concept that's known by the domain. So, by creating a book ID in your domain, which is a UUID, you actually decouple your domain even more from the actual way of storing it, but it also allows you to communicate in the application about what kind of ID it is. Because there's no difference between a 1 and a 1. And it can identify two different things. And that's a problem, because it means that you have to document in your code that you have to pass a customer ID or a book ID. But it would be more useful if the type system of PHP, which has become more powerful in the past years, would actually warn us about using the wrong IDs. So if you abstract it even more and try to enforce yourself to not use any scalar values in your domain objects, but just think about objects, or I have to say concepts that you communicate with your teammates, your code will be even more reliable. And fun fact is, whenever TYPO3 decides to change something in your domain or in the way they are storing the entities in the database, you only have to change those objects, which makes it way easier to actually go do upgrades. Yeah. And the main reason why I think this is a really good idea is because once you talk to one of your teammates, you're always talking about a book ID, never about an integer.
Yeah. So that's what domain-driven design is about, in the end, about the human and the natural language and how you name things and how you are talking about that, so that your code, or as he already mentioned yesterday, it's not about code. Domain-driven design is about the whole thing, the whole process, the whole company, and stuff like that, and we just reflect that in our code base. Yeah. So it probably is not even a book ID, but whatever the library calls it. So yep. Yeah, exactly. And he also mentions that in the book, of course. So to wrap that ID, I'm not allowed to share the book in the sense of giving it to you, of course.
I think actually mentioning UUIDs as an ID of a book is a wrong example, because books already have an ID, and that's the ISBN number.
Yeah, but if you have the same book twice in your library, then it wouldn't be unique.
If you have multiple books of the same title, then you have a problem. Yeah, then you need UUIDs.
But it's always good to keep the same concepts in your code.
Yeah, of course.
That already exist in the real world.
True.
Because we're basically just modeling the real world in our code.
Yeah.
So that's one of those examples from the book where it's actually about an order. So like the book ID, the order ID, and then in this case, that's the actual wrapper which you would use to communicate, like give the order ID, and that itself then right now hides that it's a UUID internal. So that's what object-oriented programming is all about, hiding data and adding proper communication. So in that case, our domain would first say, okay, please create a new order ID, or would go and create this UID, then would say, okay, create an order ID out of that, then create the entity and pass that entity again to the repository, which already is a valid entity, because the entity would validate itself. So within the constructor, it would have all those validation that it's actually valid, because that's what an entity is about, that you can't create invalid entities. And then we are sure, okay, we now can save that. So yeah, I fear that's everything I had. So I'm sorry about that. It's way too fast. But
I'm sorry about that. I'm glad you did it.
Thanks. Yeah, and Andy also said, finally someone who understood that and isn't telling us we try to make people sad, because obviously there are people out there who think people are doing that in order to make us sad, which feels strange. But yeah, there are strange people out there. But so that's probably why it's even more important to share that understanding. Yeah.
Maybe a fun fact from the internals of Doc3. This particular method you were mentioning had the doc block since the beginning that the input should be a string.
Yeah, and
although PHP did not enforce that, and now they are enforcing it, and it's a breaking change, and they see it as a breaking change. So it's actually not even a breaking change.
Because it was already in there.
It was already in there for years.
so at least for that, there are already solutions out there like phpSen, who inspects the doc block and would tell me you are passing an integer instead of a string. Please don't do that. So yeah. So yeah. So yeah, I guess the conclusion would be whenever there's something in your favorite library framework which is breaking change, which seems
Yeah, it's still hard for me, so that's why I've attended some workshop and stuff like that to become better. So yeah, for us it's still TYPO3 is the most, of course we could switch to another CMS, but then waste away all my last 12 years. Not now expanding. But it
So, pull this aside.
You could do the same for TYPO3. TYPO3, it's alive.
Yeah, it's alive. Well, I just created this presentation during this this conference, or actually I started with a proposal this morning, and I thought maybe it's interesting to tell you something about documentation. And one of the concepts I would like to talk about is about living documentation. Because one of the most common problems I see when I'm reading documentation is that somebody is telling me, after I read the whole document, oh yeah, we forgot to update that, it's outdated. That's not possible anymore. Those servers, well, they are off. And I think we should change that. But that will have impact on the way we are working with documentation, but also the way we are writing the documentation. Yeah, of course, why would you write documentation? It's outdated before it's complete, because you start with your implementation and then, well, yeah, nobody cares. Maybe it's the same thing as tests. Some people are convinced that you should write tests for your code. But yeah, it will cost you more effort when your tests are there, because you have to change two things when you do an update. And testing is something you can hand over to a colleague in the QA team, if you have a QA team, or just to the customer, because they will find the bugs for you. It's easy. And of course, nobody wants to read the documentation, because, well, you will ask a colleague or just somebody else on the internet, start asking questions in Slack, because it's easier rather than reading a document. However, I find it quite convenient that I can actually tell the person who's asking a question, well, here's a link, and you can actually read what's in there. If you need more, please come back. What we're using nowadays is mostly, well, Word. Maybe a strange thing, but I know that the WordPress documentation has been written in Word, the first versions. They were actually maintaining it in Google Docs, extracting the text and publishing it to their website. That's the way how they are used to do this for years. Markdown is very often used, especially for people using Git and all the nice Git solutions we have nowadays. And of course, we have Confluence and wikis. But the biggest problem with Confluence and wikis is that they are not part of our project. So we tend to forget about them, which brings us back to the outdated information that's already there. And of course, as we are software developers, we tend to write UML diagrams or draw them in some tool. And we forgot in which tool we actually created this particular picture. So we're not able to update them again. And then we end up with this kind of mess. So this is not really a solution, right?
my idea of how to improve this is see your code as your documentation. And I'm not talking about self-documenting code. Of course, your code should be written in a clear way that is useful, readable for anyone who's ever opening up that file. And you should care about the formatting and what's ever in there. But the most specific way of describing how your application actually works is your code. Because your code is just a description of what your application is actually doing. So, because what your CPU is actually executing is not the code. It's a compiled version of the code you wrote. So there are multiple levels in between. It would be interesting if we could write code in human language, so any manager could read it. However, there's a problem with the language we're speaking, and it's that it's not understood by computers. And it's kind of hard to actually compile the human language, the spoken language, to a computer program. There have been multiple projects trying to accomplish that, but I think they all failed, or they even didn't get up to a level where we are with PHP, Java, or any other programming language. But we can do some tricks to turn this around. We can read the programming language, and we can translate it back to something that's readable by humans. Because we can specify it in the most specific way so the computer knows what to do, and we can translate it back to something that our customers can read. If you attended the talk about domain-driven design, this is specifically what domain-driven design is about. Because you're using the same definitions, the same language as your customers are talking. You're creating a mind map of what the whole process, the whole business is about. This means that we can use our code, or maybe we could use our code in some way to actually generate the documentation out there in a human-readable format, because nobody wants to open up its IDE and scroll through 1,000 lines of code to actually find what a specific function is doing. Here comes my dream. I believe in a world where documentation is something that is used by everyone in the company. Not just the developers, but also your managers, your product owners, maybe even the support engineers, who can simply look up in a single web page, automatically update it whenever you change your code, with the knowledge they need to know, need to have to actually support the customer who's calling. That would be fantastic, wouldn't it? And the first start is actually creating documentation for ourselves that's up to date. The snippet you see here is a small snippet from PHP Storm. It's describing some concept about documentation. I've been working on a RST parser, a restructured text parser, for 2.5 years now. This is a part of that code. What you see here is how you should write or how you should use this particular class in your documentation. I will show you in a demo later on how this is actually rendered and how we can use this in the documentation, and this is input for my user manual. The advantage of writing this in the doc block is that it's connected to my code. Whenever I change this, I will also change that, because it's on the same field of vision. the actual file here, oh, the laptop is going to sleep. The actual file here below is just some 20 lines of code, but if this was a larger class, it would have made sense to actually have this documentation on top of the class. So everyone who's opening up the file will directly see, oh, this is what the intention of this class was and how it should be used by the end user. So let's use the force we have. Nowadays, PHP has attributes. We have doc blocks, and doc blocks exist for about 25 years now in PHP, so that's quite a long time. But we also have tools like PlantUML, who allow you to create text-based UML diagrams. Yay, we can put our diagrams in version control. No issue anymore. And we also know which tool has been used to generate that particular picture, so you can actually update your class diagram. That would be nice. And of course, the last thing, and please do not forget about it, we're developers. So we can write scripts. And we can write scripts to generate documentation. Very easy example is, I worked for a client who wants to have an overview of its network architecture. And they want to have a list of all servers in their network with the IP addresses attached. So we created a small script using Ansible that would log in to every single server, get the information, and write that back to a text file. But it's not useful for documentation purposes. But it's the input for another script that we can use to actually create the diagram we wanted to have. So we created a bunch of scripts, and whenever we shut down a server or added new servers, the script would be executed, and our documentation will be updated again. This is when your documentation becomes live. Okay, let's see. Demo time. Live demos are always an issue, so be with me. can combine the powers of different tools in a single framework to create a more closely integrated framework together with your code. So this is not actually in, but in the end we will be able to read configuration files, for example. And we can actually use the classes from your application to read those configuration files. So if you had some strange custom configuration tool, and there were some classes in your code base, you could easily attach those to phpDocumentor, and we could extract that information, and you could write your own transformer that would transform it in a nicely designed HTML page. Which means that, for example, don't know any Symfony users here? You ever used? Well, mostly, maybe you have. I think it's different in TYPO3, so that doesn't really matter. But in Symfony, the configuration, bundle configuration contains also an option to add documentation in line, but there's no tooling to extract that information some way. phpDocumentor will be that tool at some point to actually create a nice overview what kind of options you have to configure your bundles. So what phpDocumentor is doing is we're creating namespaces, and namespaces can have other namespaces, classes, and more. We also have the property information. Previously, in previous versions of phpDocumentor, you had to add a doc block above each property. But since properties are typed in PHP since PHP 7.4, I think, or 7.3, I don't remember, we can easily extract that information from the code itself and put it in here. So you don't have to do anything. If you just run your phpDocumentor on your application, you will get this out of the box. There's no need for any other configuration. We will just do it. If we click through, then we see that we can actually read the function description. And it's formatted in a way we can read it. But of course, if you want to, we can transform it in a completely different way because it's based on templates. If you want to provide your own templates, well, feel free. We bring this. If you want to add more, you can add doc blocks, and then you can add descriptions about what this specific URL thing should be, because it's just a string and we can put in everything. But now, the real advantage, and that's this, because this is end user information. The text doesn't matter, please don't read it. You can read it on the website later on if it's published. But this is the same kind of information as you're reading on a daily basis based on restructured text. Let's see what else was in here. Oh, yeah, we were talking about class diagrams. It would have been nice if we could create a class diagram, right? We want to have a phpDocumentor class diagram for this particular namespace. We will do the rest. And I have a diagram somewhere over here. Let me see where it is. stupid thing about this is that I can easily navigate in my IDE to find a particular page, but I can never find it in the documentation because the search function is not working correctly. That's something we have to work on. Let's see, where is it? No. Oh, yeah. It's not this one. Why I cannot find this one anymore? Oh. There's quite a lot of documentation here. Oh, sorry, I cannot find it anymore for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, back to the other powers. It's because we created this restructured text library, and this list of classes, it would be quite a time-consuming thing to create, because yeah, there are quite a lot of classes in here. And it would have been nice if this would have been automatically generated, right? You can do that. We can simply create a list of classes, and here you see the documentation that we just saw in the code snippet, rendered in an HTML page, in an overview that is can be used by the users consuming this library. They don't even have to be aware of the fact that a certain class exists. They just want to have a concept called, in this thing, an attention box, which draws a box with a warning sign. And this is how documentation should be, in my opinion. This is how you connect your documentation with your code, and how you make it easier for you as a developer to keep it up to date. There's much more to discover, and we're just at the beginning of something new. I think within 5 years, phpDocumentor will cover at least 10% of the ecosystem of PHP to provide the information. And you will be able to navigate between this kind of documentation and the actual class, because it's all connected. The only thing we have to add is some AI bot that will scrape this and allow us to chat with the documentation. Because we don't want to read this, we just want to have answers. And if you are searching for answers, you're always searching for the wrong keywords. Because Googling is not about finding the right information, it's about finding the right keywords to find the information you need. And that's where AI might be interesting. And maybe someday we will implement that as well in phpDocumentor. But it has to be done in a safe way, because we don't want to expose our company internal information to some large tech companies on the other side of the ocean. And of course, these kind of diagrams would have been nice if they were automatically generated. Unfortunately, that's still work in progress. This one is drawn by hand, or at least by plant UML. But in the end, we will add attributes to your code. We will allow you to add attributes to your code, and you will be able to automatically generate the flow in your code, and it will make your life so much easier, because you don't have to draw this thing over and over again, and it will always be up to date.
Short question. Regarding the attributes attributes. I guess there are events that's currently working on that receiver can dump the program workflow from one request already. So if I would have behavior-driven tests, for example, wouldn't it make more sense not to add attributes within my code, but to have those tests, those executed, stored somewhere, and that's connected and then picked up. So one thing less to care about, one more thing you are paying in and stuff like that.
It's definitely an interesting concept of attaching your tests as input for your documentation as well, because we're all naming our tests in a certain way to cover a certain use case. And especially on behavior-driven tests, they are quite explaining what they are doing. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting idea to put into at some point. Yeah, I think that's about my story. If you want to get in touch, this is me. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions about documentation. I'm happy to help you forward. You can also find me in the TYPO3 Slack. Yeah, so thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a question, this is your project or you're working with a group of people on it?
phpDocumentor was started about 30 years ago. I'm not that old, so I did start programming quite early, but I wasn't 5 when I started programming. It was started by one single person. Nowadays, it's mainly me working on the project, but there are more people involved, and especially for the RST parser, it's really a community project. So 3 of the members of the TYPO3 documentation team are actually involved with that part. And we also have a strong connection with the Symfony team and also with the Doctrine team. I think during the summer, Doctrine will switch to this project to generate their documentation, and Symfony, well, we don't know yet, but they're planning. So yeah, we try to get more people on board.
Would it, for example, be a cool project for a student to work on for a project for a thesis or something like that?
It depends on what your student is interested in, because behind the scenes, this is all about parsers, lexers, and compilers. We are in the PHP part. We are actually reading the PHP code and extracting doc blocks. So you can imagine that it's quite a complex piece of code. And the RST parser is even more complex because we have to do all plumbing ourselves. There's no framework involved. So I think it's kind of hard for a student to actually get into this, unless they are, really into to compiler technology. A master student, maybe, yeah, but not the average software developer. And of course, writing templates, helping us with style issues, all kind of contributions are welcome, of course.
So, I mean, what you've shown with the different integrations that you can make in order to generate, make your code into documentation, or, like you mentioned as well, flows and stuff like that. One argument that I have heard from people as well, but we have a CMS. Why don't we use our CMS to document the CMS? Isn't that the natural way of doing it? But I think you're demonstrating pretty well that, you know, CMSs have their limit, maybe. You know, that they're...
Well, the problem with CMSs is somebody has to put in this information. So maybe this is an interesting thought. What if you would be able to create an extension on a tool like this that could actually feed the information to your CMS? So the actual content shown on the pages is shown to the user using the CMS, but the information that they see is not written in the CMS, but it's version controlled and automatically generated by that version controlled information.
So actually, you would have a renderer in quotation marks that actually creates the content elements in TYPO3, for example.
Yeah. And this was not my idea. This is actually an idea coming from the WordPress documentation team, because they have an extension on WordPress that they are using to show the documentation of WordPress to the end users. But there's also documentation extracted from the code in there. Currently they are using some low-level libraries to extract that information, but yeah, maybe at some day, once we are able to hook them on as well, they will be able this as well. And then it becomes a PHP project.
So you've mentioned it's extendable, so I can add my custom PHP code in order to extract data from somewhere else, right?
Well, right now it's not really extendable in a way that you can attach your own code. But like I said at the beginning of the presentation, you can also you could write a script that is generated restructured text, of course. And that's what I do quite often, is that I write a small script that extracts information from another system, put that into a certain format, and then transpile it back to a format phpDocumentor can handle.
Because thinking about TYPO3, we have the table configuration area, so we already have a big configuration describing the whole data structure of our system. And at least some of our customers want an explanation which data is available, which types of contents, why do we have book records and stuff like that. So this information is already there. Maybe you need to add some description, but it's already there, so it would make sense to just extract it and make a living documentation out of it.
Yeah, well, I think the advantage of using a tool that is working in between is that you can put more information and combine it with other information, and then it becomes a system, or at least your own documentation framework. There is no single answer to living documentation for a single company. There will always be tools that you have to write yourself. And for these kind of specific use cases, maybe somebody in the TYPO3 community will stand up and will say, oh, well, we'll write an extension for you to get this done, or create some pipeline tooling that is able to put this information in, but yeah.
And another question, you were talking about plant UMLs, so in order to draw those diagrams, I need Java in order to run plant UML diagrams.
Yeah. I didn't.
No proper alternative to plant UML. So.
Well, I heard about Mermaid.js. Never did anything with it yet, but it seems to be very useful. It's a JavaScript library, so you don't need to install Java on your own machine. Of course, nowadays we also have Docker. phpDocumentor ships with a Docker image, so basically you just need Docker if you're using Docker in your development environment, or just run it in your CI environment, because that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, but yeah, main message, please start automating your documentation and stop just writing it. Anything else, or shall we go to the bar for a drink?
Just a quick one. As this is the last session, first of all, thank you very much for all your work. I hope maybe all as community can learn and inspire each other, but also share each other and benefit from each other. That's what I was looking for. So really thank you for that. And I would thank you all as well. I would like to suggest if you all go to the main room, because then if they are finished, we can do a quickly closing to save some time and to end this session today. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.